In higher ed, we're all looking for big wins, but reducing a 75% application abandonment rate and achieving a 90% conversion rate, that's next level transformation. Michael Battersworth, CMO at Texas State Technical College, shares how they achieved this by streamlining the application process with Element 451.
Our Element journey began out of a necessity. We were switching to a new SIS, and the application process was going to pose some real usability issues for us. We felt that application was going to hamper our enrollment. So we began quickly to evaluate different CRMs, different applications. So for context on that, our conversion rate with the prior application had about 75% abandonment of people clicking apply to submit. And the first weeks after going live with Element, we saw an 80% conversion, and that's now up to 90. So improving the usability of that application on the front end process has had a significant advance in our intake.
When technology works for students, it works for you. Visit element451.com to see how simplifying the application process with artificial intelligence will lead to significant results for your institution. Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where each week we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experiences. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology. The Higher Ed Geek Podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network, a robust collection of shows designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 265 with Kate DeForest, Web and Digital Content Coordinator at SUNY Oswego. Really appreciated her coming onto the show to kind of help enlighten me and our audience here about digital accessibility efforts at higher ed institutions. There is a lot to do there, and she has a great approach to kind of launching campus-wide accessibility initiatives and how to kind of chip away at this effort, and just sort of really helpful kind of guiding philosophies that, you know, folks in this space can use to work with their colleagues to just create more digitally accessible learning environments and supportive, engaging, environments for students. Really appreciate Kate being on to kind of help shepherd us into this space, not one that we've explored a whole lot in the recent past. So just felt like it was time to talk more about it. So please sit back and enjoy this episode number 265 with Kate DeForest. I'm really excited to speak with you. You're somebody who kind of came in through the ether. We were putting ourselves out there to try to bring in a lot of different voices and backgrounds and different topics and themes, especially for our show. We try to cover kind of the gamut in higher ed and digital transformation, what's happening kind of across the whole country and world and everything. So appreciate you being willing to come on and talk about digital accessibility. I know that's a big focus of your current role. Curious, I guess, how you got into this work, like what's your background and how you got to be where you are today doing this kind of work.
My journey into accessibility was quite accidental. I did not have any idea what digital accessibility was. I knew accessibility, obviously, but I had a very different definition of it in my head before I got started. A number of years ago, I was let go from 2 separate jobs within the span of 5 years for completely separate reasons. And at that point, I decided that my life wasn't really on the trajectory that I wanted it to be on. So I did what any normal, sane person would do. As a single mom of 3 kids, I turned my life upside down and I went back to grad school full time. Still not quite sure how I survived that period, but I made it. I did it. Oswego is my undergrad alma mater, and they offer a graphic design, digital media graduate program, which is what I went for. And I very quickly realized that I am not the best graphic designer. However, my skills sort of focus in more on the behind the scenes functional design that goes along with like web design, HTML and CSS, information architecture, content strategy, and digital accessibility. Now, mind you, before 2018, I did not have any idea what any of those words meant. Like, I had heard of HTML, but I didn't know what any of those things were. Around that same time, prior to me going back to school in 2017, Oswego and many other schools were faced with a complaint from the Office of Civil Rights about web pages and digital content and stuff and such not being accessible. So that was the beginning of Oswego's accessibility journey. So essentially, as a result of that complaint and a result of going back to school and being in the right place at the right time with the right skills, all kind of merged together and the stars aligned, and I was hired full-time at Oswego as their digital accessibility analyst.
It's an amazing story, and I appreciate you sharing it, because I think just like the teachable moments from that, like regardless if people listen to, like what's their background or interest in this topic or whatever else, like that idea of you can kind of like stack the deck a little bit, that idea of like, well, I was learning skills and I knew we're going to be like super relevant. Like you can be better prepared for that right moment, right place and all that. There was so much movement, I think, to kind of like build out this sort of whole digital ecosystem of just sort of people being like kind of on the social internet and just spending a lot of time online and doing so much on, like that was sort of like cascading and rippling out and all that. And now we're in this moment where it's like, okay, we've built out this whole infrastructure. We need to make sure that as many people can, access it and utilize it as possible. And it's, I guess at times feels like it's sort of like we need to sort of like double back and sort of check our work kind of thing, like we've built these, all these websites and things. And now we have to like, sort of get under the hood and do some like, proper maintenance, I guess. But I guess that's my sort of anecdotal take. I mean, I'm coming in this pretty fresh, I guess. So I'm excited to kind of learn more about it. I'm sure a lot of folks listening are as well. So in that vein, before we get too far, we were kind of talking about your own journey, sort of discovering this work. So if you had to do this sort of like elevator pitch, I guess, of like, what is digital accessibility work? Like, how would you sort of define what it is that you're doing, or, kind of what it is that you're sort of working towards?
That is a fantastic question. And I think it's a very pertinent question, because a lot of times people hear accessibility and they think like the colloquial definition of, can it be seen? Can it be heard? Can it be accessed? Can it be reached or used? Right. And that's not wrong. But from our perspective, digital accessibility, as paraphrased from the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights website, digital accessibility means a person with a disability and a person without a disability can have a same or similar experience in the same or similar manner.
Yeah, because I think like, and I guess this could be a quick follow-up, like it is to me, like at times it's much of like very tangible things like you're saying, like the idea of like, have people utilize screen readers or like alt text, like those are very explicit sort of things. I think things are like a lot of platforms are making, enabling those sort of things a lot easier. But then in my mind, it's even like, I guess just the idea, because I think this is sort of like a circumventing way to get to the goal of like everybody can access it, sort of have a similar experience of like, if you have a lot of graphics or different things that like just make it like load really slowly or whatever else like that, I'm sure kind of inhibits the ability of other things to do like what they are designed to do to help make them more accessible. But I feel like it's that idea of like, you can then start thinking about like, oh, well, what if somebody's trying to access this website from like an area that doesn't have like, hyper, high speed internet or whatever else. It's like, we need to make sure there's like, it's either just designed on its fundamentals to be pretty lean, or I know some websites you can easily kind of click into sort of a like distilled down version. And I'm assuming maybe that can also serve other purposes to make it easier to utilize a screen reader or something else. So like, is there like elements like that of like, there's a lot of paths that end up in the point of like someone with a disability, someone with not, are able to access it and have a similar experience. Like there's a lot of components that you can kind of put into place to achieve that goal.
Yeah. There are a lot of different things that can be maintained. And of course, disabilities or abilities is such a wide spectrum. So just because one person is visually impaired, you put something in place for them to see it, that doesn't mean that another person who's visually impaired is going to be able to see the screen the same way. So there's a lot of, intricacies. But to your point that you were just sort of saying about, I think 2020, when the pandemic hit, really, really kind of brought into focus the fact that like people in slow internet areas or people who were far out who didn't have great internet connection. 2020 hit, everything went online. Now all of a sudden people are working from home. People are going to school from home, right? So the whole family is trying to get online all at the same time. and browsers are, crashing or not loading or whatever, screen readers and the ability to see websites all of a sudden became a little more important just because people were no longer sitting in a classroom. So there were like all these different things that kind of were bubbling under the surface. But I don't really know if we as a society I don't think we were actively ignoring them. I just think we didn't know. Like you don't know what you don't know. So we have to figure out a way to put those provisions in place to allow people to have similar experiences.
Yeah, because I think the other thing that I know is like a really tangible one that a lot of like website builders and stuff have been really good about is like flagging color contrast issues. So like it's just saying like, hey, it's probably going to be hard for people, with like low, vision to be able to see. Yeah, even stuff with like that I'm thinking about that has become a bit more normalized is like if there's like a lot of flashing images, that's like always kind of like a kind of trigger warning to say like that's upcoming and maybe you either want to skip it or turn something off. But I'm sure certain common sense things that you can do that like as many of those different audiences as well as you can, but I think you can't do this work and then sort of be like, all right, we're done. Like you'd want on the front end to not be like turning someone off because they can't even like access your website for one reason or another because they can't read it won't load. Preemptively do that maintenance and like you're steps ahead from other folks who aren't committing to that work. Honoring what you said, obviously this is very complex and kind of nuanced work. There's a lot of different details here, but now I'm curious to know, how do you approach an effort like this? I think that can seem so overwhelming. Like it is the idea of like, oh my gosh, our website's huge. Like, I mean, we have to do this for like all the pages or whatever else, or like, it could, I think, seem very daunting to people. So what is your point of view on like ways that you can approach this effort to make it feel less daunting?
So quick funny story. When we first started talking about accessibility on the Oswego campus after this OCR complaint, we were really trying to push out to faculty members, the student in your course is requesting these materials. You need to make your materials more accessible. And they would say, what do you mean? My materials are posted online. Like they're accessible. So A, we had to define that as we just did. And then B, they kind of pushed back. And for some reason, whatever words were coming out of my mouth, people heard, you want me to do this whole list of accessibility things to all of my materials that I ever created in the history of ever, starting right now, due tomorrow. I was like, no, that's not exactly what I said. but people were envisioning this huge insurmountable mountain. So a couple of years ago, I read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Are you familiar with this book? Yes, it's a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it to everyone. I kind of wish that I could get like a little kickback from Mr. Clear because I talk about this book all the time. It has nothing to do with digital accessibility. However, the premise is that 1% shift can be easily implemented and then can therefore produce significant changes. And very early on in the book, I was on like page 20 or something, and the light bulb in my head went off. And I thought, oh my gosh, when we talk about digital accessibility on the Oswego campus, we are sort of at that time unknowingly implementing or using some of these methods that James Clear is outlining in this book. So I read the book through the lens of digital accessibility, which was very interesting in my mind, and came away with a whole bunch of different ideas on how to use that 1% shift mindset to promote accessibility within the campus. So we broke down the various components of accessibility, we being the work group on accessibility practices. We have this work group that really dives into troubleshooting and, trying to promote accessibility and help people figure it out. We realized that the approach to accessibility that we started with at Oswego was very reactive. So a student would request accessible materials, right? And then part of my responsibility as the analyst position was to assess and remediate those online course materials. So a student would request accessible materials and I'd get to work. Between 2018 and 2020, my average course load was about 20 courses per semester. Well, then everybody knows what happens. In 2020, the pandemic hit. Everything went online, right? Everything shut down. All the classes were online. In the fall of 2020, there were 200 courses on my list that I was supposed to remediate. And I managed to get through about 100 of them. But we realized that approach was not sustainable because, again, in that point in 2020, nobody knew what was going to happen with the pandemic. We didn't know what the future of higher ed looked like, right? So the work group on accessibility practices took that 1% mindset shift and decided to flip the script. And we knew that we needed to sort of put the onus back on the content creators to create more accessible materials rather than relying on remediation. So we designed a campus-wide accessibility challenge. This was a 10-day challenge that was open to all campus personnel, and we used that 1% shift and broke down accessibility to one aspect that we focused on every day. So each day focused on a different aspect of accessibility. So looking at the big mountain, right, is like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff. It's huge. I have to do all these things. When you break it down, for example, structured content, I have to create headings within my document. In both Microsoft Word and Google Doc, it's like a click on a drop-down menu to structure a heading properly so that a screen reader can read it. That's easy to implement. Like, that's easy to understand, right? Text equivalents, as you were saying, with graphics and images and things, adding alternative text or text equivalents so that a screen reader can read what the image is supposed to be. That's a little bit gray and mushy because it's very subjective, but it's an easy concept to understand. So really breaking those individual concepts down into the 1% and having people focus on that one thing at a time really, I think, helped sort of ease people back, right? People were stressed in 2020. We didn't really know what we were doing. Nobody knew what was going on. We were very overwhelmed. So using that 1% mindset and combining that with the other principles of atomic habits as well, really stripped it all down and made things easier for people to manage and digest. And another thing that I will mention too is it's really important to understand that we will never be 100% accessible to 100% of the people 100% of the time. I think that's really, really important to point out because again, people are like, oh, I have to make all my things accessible. And they like drive themselves crazy trying to get into these little tiny minutiae that they don't understand. So by, again, stripping that back and saying, okay, well, I can't be 100% accessible, but I can be 1% more accessible than I was last week or last semester or last year, whatever. So moving ahead just 1% at a time keeps the initiative going and it keeps you pushing forward in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to approach this. And even like, I guess in my mind, it's the idea that you're enabling every individual to improve by 1%. So it's like, yeah, collectively, we're all just sort of marginally sort of rising the tide of just sort of our like, accessibility and sort of, filling up our kind of capabilities there. But yeah, you can't anticipate everything. And it's going to be just like a rhythm, like a workflow that you hopefully are just sort of embedding and getting folks to be consistently mindful of. And I'm curious, I guess, as a quick follow up on your take of like, one, I think, yeah, like the feeling that people get, I think, when this work is sort of like, quote unquote, dumped on their lap and just sort of, dictated to them. They're like, just do it and do it, yesterday and whatever, like you said, breaking it down, allowing there to be that sort of space to say like, okay, today or this week, however, you might want to approach it as an institution, like we're focusing on this component. Like this is, what we're going to be working towards. This is why it's important. And this is how you do it. Like just that sort of like slow, intentional rhythm that you can sort of get into of just sort of like, at a certain point, I'm sure like you might like launch an effort like this, start somewhere, and then over time, you'd kind of be just kind of always being like, all right, here we are again. We're talking about alt text and images. Like we're, and so the idea is like, it's something that people need to be reminded of, nudged on and all that, but doing it in that sort of piecemeal fashion, kind of bite-sized portions and giving it sort of the breathing room for people to understand in the context of like, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And then like, I'm sure like a lot of people, it's like, oh yeah, I was never told how to do this. I was just, yeah, like, make it more accessible. And it's like, I will try. And, but so like my quick follow-up is that like, thankfully, I feel like, I was sort of revealing a couple of anecdotal things that I've observed is I do feel like a lot of tools have made this work a bit easier. Like it will flag things for you. Like it may not like prevent you from publishing your blog post, or whatever else. If, this thing is like, not as accessible as it could be, but it will at least like flag things and maybe give you like, hey, here's a little like help center thing to, give you some pointers. So I guess like, is that your feeling as well? And I think as sort of a undercurrent to due diligence, as I feel like every podcast has to mention, like, are you feeling like AI is sort of something that can be sort of a supplement and an assistant in this work? So I think just, do you feel like generally tools have helped to enable this to be easier? And do you feel like AI is starting to be a bit more of a part of the solution?
I think the checkers that are built into the applications and software like Microsoft Word and Google docs. They're a great place to start, especially when you're sort of just getting into accessibility. Going back to what you said, creating that rhythm. And if I can just talk about that for just a second too, again, with so many pieces being so big and so many things to learn, people are like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I don't have the mental capacity. Taking one thing and focusing on it and making that a habit and implementing it, regardless of whether you're sending an email to your best friend or you're sending an email campus wide, or even if it's just internal documents that only you are reading, getting into the habit of implementing like structured headings and embedding your links and, doing these simplistic things like that really help reinforce the fact that, okay, this really isn't hard. And now that all the emails that I do this certain way. And so they're more accessible. All the documents that I create, regardless of who sees them, I create this certain way. So they're more accessible. So it just becomes sort of second nature. When you open a document, you automatically start with a heading 1. And then as you create your sections, you add heading 2s. So that takes effort on, the individual person. Obviously, I can't tell you how to create your documents, Dustin, but my hope is that by, saying this and promoting this and advocating for it, people will understand that it's really not that difficult to start. And then to your point of the checkers and the automation, again, those are a great basis. They will not give you the automatic checkers that are built within the software will not give you all of the specifics of everything. If you open up a Microsoft Word doc with no headings in it, the checker will tell you that there are no issues, which is wrong because your document needs headings. So there's those things. The default red in Microsoft Word, I believe, does not meet color contrast standards either. So there are little things like that hopefully these companies will continue to improve. But it's a good basis to get started, to get you understanding what to look for in your documents. And they do kind of like the help centers do kind of give you little tips and pointers on how to fix them, how to update them. So I think it's not a bad thing, the checkers. AI is, as we all know, a whole different rabbit hole with a whole different conversation. I have not completely dove down that rabbit hole quite yet. I use AI very minimally. And I think that it can be used if you like copy content and paste it in and say, is this accessible? What do I need to do? It may spit out some very legitimate things. I honestly have not tried that yet, although I really should now that you've talked about it. It might be a little bit higher level than the checkers within the softwares. It's not going to solve all your problems, and it's not going to update your document for you. It may give you legitimate solutions like, oh, I see the URL, HTTPS, blah, 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 that needs to be embedded within the wording. In fact, in my own work, as I have copied content that have what I call naked URLs, just the HTTP listed out there, I copy all the content and stick it into GPT, and it will embed that link behind words. So it does have the quote smartness to take some things and automatically put them in. Headings are another one. If I copy a document or content that has like a bolded statement or separated into paragraphs and I throw it into Chat GPT, it will more than likely send back headings that separate out the different sections. So it does have a capability. I wouldn't trust it completely, but the capability is there. And I think that it could be improved upon as we continue to grow technology-wise.
Struggling to make sense of endless research? At the AI Engage Summit, you'll get a hands-on tutorial and meet Notebook LM, Google's AI assistant that transforms complex information like academic papers and lecture videos into content that will engage your target audience. The event is free and virtual. Register now at enrollify.org/engage. Yeah, I think that's like where it's at with a lot of things is like, trust but verify, where it's just like, okay, I know you're probably going to do what I'm asking, 9 times out of 10, but I'm going to like double check it. And I'm sure, yeah, like it's going to be fairly rudimentary in what it can do for you. Some platforms will like be able to like suggest, like they'll use AI to suggest like alt text and stuff. And I'll say, again, that's another thing you'd want to like trust but verify and all that. Like, so I think like it is that idea that there's an acknowledgement that it can try to make it more efficient. Obviously, it is still going to take people's sort of deliberate effort of like, this is a step that I need to take before I like publish a blog post or put up a web page or whatever, to utilize whatever tool that they are using and to make sure that they're doing it the right way. It is something that people need continual reminders on, support, that it needs to be sort of given room sort of to breathe and to given sort of its due diligence and everything to understand like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And, here's like some step-by-step guides. I would hope that many institutions have folks like you working there that are like giving this sort of TLC that it deserves and everything. I think just really being empathetic, I guess, to like how people are like coming at this. Like, I do think a lot of people earnestly do want to like, do good, do better, those sort of things. And I feel like I've had some of these conversations recently of like, change management obviously is always just sort of like a thing to be thinking about and talking about, because like whatever sort of innovation or, thing that you're trying to do, like that is like, if not half the battle, sometimes like most of the battle is just being like, people understand like, oh yeah, we should be doing, X, Y, or Z thing. But like, shepherding people through that like process and building a coalition and being kind of empathetic and patient and all that kind of stuff, like that's such an important ingredient and kind of all this. So to really sort of like, I think, solidify this though, because I think we've sort of kind of alluded to it, but to sort of like bold circle, underline kind of the point, like what makes this work so important from your point of view? Like we're gonna give all this sort of like time and effort and sort of rhythm and cycles and 1% getting better every day. Why is this work so important? Why does it deserve kind of all this focus?
We tend to all live in our own little bubbles of convenience and comfort, and as humans, just by nature, we can be quite self-centered. We don't like to go outside of our comfort zone. We don't like to see things that are outside our comfort zone. And I realized, before I start getting slammed, I realized that is an extremely broad, generalized statement. And that's not to say that all people are bad. That's not to say that everybody is an egotistical SOB. It's kind of our nature. We tend not to look at things from another person's perspective unless we are forced to, or unless it's presented to us, like unless, it's really put in front of us. So I feel that it's very important to bring this topic to light and put it in front of people, because people simply don't know what they don't know. And I don't believe that people intentionally put barriers in place when we're talking about digital content and all that sort of thing. And even in the physical world, I don't think people intentionally put barriers in place that would prevent others from getting to the building or from accessing their digital content. I think it's just simply we don't know what we don't know. And digital accessibility and such has been sort of bubbling below the surface, and it's well known in certain areas. And those who don't ever have to deal with it, it's just not known. People think accessible means I can get to it on the web. People don't understand necessarily that when other people open a website, they don't see it the same way that I might see it. It's just a matter of educating people and bringing this topic to light and saying there's a lot to learn, but it can be distilled down so you kind of get into the rhythm of things, and you can do things that are simple that will help improve the digital accessibility of your documents without putting a whole ton of effort into it. Structured headings is a great example. Without headings, screen reader users have to listen to the entire document. When you put headings in, now suddenly they can jump from section to section, and it cuts down their reading time, right? So that right there, that one thing that's a click on a drop-down menu to implement a structured heading, just improved the document accessibility by 50% or something. So I do think it's really important to bring it to light. I also think that we tend to sort of acclimate and use things that were created for people with disabilities without realizing it. So things like curb cuts. When was the last time you walked around a curb cut to step up onto the curb, right? We don't. We walk up the slant on the curb cut. Automatic doors at the grocery store. I don't even know if my grocery store has non-automatic doors. Like everybody walks through the front automatic doors. They were not created for an able-bodied person like myself. They were created for people in wheelchairs, for people with walkers. But then people with strollers, people with babies, people who, like everybody uses the automatic doors. Hands-free GPS is another great example. I consider myself to be directionally deficient. If I don't already know where I'm going, I need that GPS. So again, that particular thing was not created for my person, but I use it all the time because I get very confused when I don't have a GPS in front of me. We do not have a hearing impairment in my house, yet every time the TV goes on, closed captions are there. Just because it's easier to comprehend, it's easier to digest. And actually, my kids started that when my teenagers. I came in one day and they were watching TV and they had the closed captions on. And I was like, oh, okay, we're doing this now. All right, sure. That's okay. So these things that were originally created for people with disabilities, all of us, the majority of us, have sort of acclimated into our lives, and we use them without even really thinking what the original purpose was. And I think that's important to point out too, because opening people's eyes and really looking around and saying, like, how ableist is this life that I live? And for me personally, I completely realize it's totally ableist. I have a lot of blind spots. But I see things differently now that I'm like more aware of how other people perceive the world. So I think that's a very important step. Goes back to like what the 1980s G.I. Joe, like the more you know, knowing is half the battle, that whole thing.
That's right. That's right.
I think it's really important. So by having the conversations and bringing attention to some of these oversights that many of us have, I think that it helps us understand how accessibility can have a broad impact regardless of the audience that we're trying to reach, regardless of people's abilities.
Yeah, and I appreciate the very geeky reference there to bring it home. And yeah, because I think that's like one very important point is like, because I'm sure if some people, again, like it's coming from a place probably where it's just like, all right, I'm already like super busy and all that. Like, why are we doing this? It's just going to help like a few people, whatever. It's like, hold on a minute. Like, all these things help a lot of people. So like, it's sort of aspiring to this point of like, universal access and all, like there's these kind of terms that are always, like you said, like, we're never going to be 100% perfect all the time, everywhere, always. But like, if we can always be doing things that can help, everybody, but they certainly help people that have kind of certain deficiency where it's just, they need it to be able to access this. But then it's like, well, actually, yeah, it also helps a lot of other people too that, may not require it, but it just makes their life easier. And that's just like, you're doing good, just for the sake of it kind of thing. But yeah, the other thing for me too, though, is just like, obviously like we kind of have like the broad focus on this show. Like this is work that is impactful for prospective students, their families, whoever might be supporting them, current students, alumni. Like you don't want to be losing out on these engagement opportunities, whatever it might be for any of these populations, because you're like, not putting in the work to do some of this like common sense stuff, that make, everybody be able to access the same resource, and close to, or, kind of exactly the same way. And like, yeah, I was going to say closed captioning to think so much, like a lot of mine is around like things that I'm thinking of are around like content creation, and like even with like providing transcripts or different things, or like sometimes you'll even see like I know NPR is really good about this, but like, you'll be reading a news story. They've got like the audio embed right there. So if you just want to listen, like there's certain things that just make it super easy. If it's just like, oh, I would prefer to listen to it than read it. But then if it's like, well, if I need to hear it versus reading it, it's super easy to just do that versus like, hoping that they, built this in a way that is, sort of enabling folks to use like the tools that they use to try to, engage with content and stuff. So, because yeah, and something else where like in my background with digital education, it's like, if you're creating learning content, that idea of, utilizing videos and whatever else, like the idea that sometimes these online courses are, more accessible by design, because it could be like, oh, well, like there's this video that again should have closed captioning and all this good stuff. But then it's also like, if I needed to watch it like 4 or 5 times to like get the concept, it's like kind of more accessible in that way. So like, I think what we're seeing now, thankfully, is that you can try to bring in like the best of both worlds of like, yeah, this is a course where we come together in person to have discussions and all that, but like we're still taking sort of the best practices of like having the online shell that is, kind of the companion to this course, because that just way more easily, and people don't have to like make, sort of extraneous requests and stuff. Is like, we've built this course, we've built it to be accessible. That's where all the sort of like learning content and things that you'll need live. But then when we're together in person, we're having discussions and doing whatever else, like that's kind of how that time can be best spent. And then we're creating a learning environment that should be able to be as accessible as can be to the most people. So how you're saying, like, it pops up in our lives way more than I think people realize. And the idea of how seamless it can feel and everything, like, I think that's such a great like piece of advice. Like, it doesn't have to feel like it's sort of like scarlet letter of just being like, oh, I gotta like go over here to access the thing. It's like, no, it's just like built by its design to be accessible, and you can just toggle closed captions or whatever, like. So yeah, I guess really love all the sort of like advice and resources and things that you've mentioned so far. So wanted to give you space. If anything else that you'd want to mention as we're kind of closing out here, stuff for folks to check out or to be kind of thinking about as they're doing this work.
Definitely Atomic Habits, which again doesn't focus directly on accessibility, but I think the principles can be applied to any area of our life. So I think if you read it through the lens of either accessibility in general or just how do I make life better for others, I think to me, it was helpful. So hopefully other people find that as well. A couple of other things that I thought of: the James A. Webb telescope, the image that came out like a couple of years ago, right? When this whole big thing, this image came out for the James A. Webb telescope. I don't have it up in front of me, but I want people to like Google it and read the alt text, because the scientists that were responsible for the alt text behind that first image is just amazing. And it like really describes it. It mentions 8-point diffraction points, or 8-point diffraction light. It talks about the wispiness in one corner of the picture. Like, it's really detailed. So if you were to close your eyes, or for those who can't actually see the picture, and listen to that alt text, it paints a picture, as opposed to like something I would probably end up coming up with was like stars as seen by the James A. Webb telescope. I mean, for most of us, like that would be a somewhat legitimate alt text, but these scientists really put some effort and thought into the alt text for that particular image. So that would be awesome. Just again, for people to get an idea of what is it like. There's a company called Two Blind Brothers, which is founded by literally two blind brothers. I forget the name of the disease. It starts with an S. Stargard's disease, I think it might be. But the center of their vision starts to blur, and eventually it like spreads out, so they become blind. They can't see anything. And they have a website that sells products. I've bought their products. They're really great. But the one cool thing that I remember about that website is there's a little button that you can click that shows you what it's like to view the website with their disease, like with the disease that they have, which again, I think is just another sort of side tool. Like, oh, I open up a web page, I can see it. Great. Oh, what happens if I click this button? Now I can't see the website the way that I'm used to seeing it. I see it the way that they see it, which is kind of like, pun not really intended, an eye-opener, like, oh my gosh, so that's just another little side thing. There's also one other thing that I'll mention. There's a concept called circles of influence that was introduced in social psychology back in the 1940s. And then this was popularized by Stephen Covey in the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And this framework states that circumstances around us can be categorized into basically 3 different levels, right? There's the circle of concern, which is things we have no control over. Like everything that's happening in the world right now, most of us have no control over. That's a circle of concern. There's the circle of influence, which is like the middle level. And that is aspects that we can impact through our actions and our choices. Although we may not be able to directly control what happens, we can impact what happens. And then we have the circle of control, which is closest to us. Those are the things that we have direct control over. I think that many of us have more power in the circle of influence than we may think. So again, focusing on that 1%, what one aspect can you improve in your own daily habits or in your own materials that can help make them better? Leading by example, right? Starting the conversations, like, I'm a peon in my organization. I don't really have much to say about anything. I don't have any pull. I don't have any control. If you start the conversations and like work your way up, and even, have the gumption to maybe have a conversation with like the head of your department or the head of the institution or whatever, and say, look, this is really bothering me. We really need to make these materials accessible. What can we do about it? Being that squeaky wheel and starting the conversations, becoming involved in accessibility groups or committees, or if your institution or campus or whatever doesn't have those, starting the conversations to get those going. The work group on accessibility practices at the Oswego campus started somewhat accidentally through a conversation. There was an instructional designer and a faculty member who were just kind of chatting one day, and they both realized that they were working on separate accessibility focused projects. And they were like, oh, you're doing that? Well, I'm doing this. Oh, okay. Maybe we should like help each other out. Maybe we should get together and work on this together. So they formed this group that now is like 15 or 20 people, and it sort of expanded from there. And it all started from just one conversation. So even though you might think, oh, I can't really do anything within my organization, there's things that you can control personally that you can do that then sort of lead by example and kind of branch out. And there's things that you can control within your circle of influence to try to, spread the word and spread the gospel, as it were, and push the initiative forward. So I think that that's important to point out to people as well.
That is wonderful advice to end on, and some great other kind of resources for folks to look into and get inspiration from. That could be, depending on where someone is placed, their role in the organization, kind of where their organization is at doing the work. It could be like, I need some assets to kind of give some good learning moments here, like some of those things that you mentioned, like kind of the peak examples of alt text, or, sort of living more viscerally kind of the experience that other people have. And thank you so much for all that you do, all that you shared, for giving your time here, with ways to connect with you and the stuff you mentioned in the show notes and description for the episode. So I certainly learned a lot. It gave me a lot to think about here. So really appreciate your time.
Dustin, I appreciate you, and I appreciate the audience, and I'm glad to be here. Happy to have the time to talk with people. So thank you very much.
The Hired Geek Podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances you'll like all the other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing constantly, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better hired professional. Our shows help you find your next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your host. Learn from people like Jamie Hunt, Seth Odell, Dave Kibbolds, and Eddie Francis, as well as so many other of your favorite leaders in higher education. Enrollify is made possible by the support of Element 451, a leading AI-powered, all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.